Well, good afternoon, Southminster Scholars. This is our first time back together in this class in a year. It's nice to be here where we can have questions and answers. One of the dark undersides of the Industrial Revolution was the abuses of unrestrained capitalism. Industrialists favored a tight money supply to keep prices high, but small businesses and farmers whose operations relied on accessible credit favored looser money. That is, more of it in circulation. The Homestead Act saw hundreds of thousands take advantage of free land for farming. They required credit to get started, and then credit to carry them from one harvest to the other, and also to purchase labor-saving equipment. Serious depressions rocked the nation in 1873 for 6 years, 1893 for 7 years. We call them depressions. At the time, they called them panics. Small businessmen and farmers had put up their properties as collateral for the credit required to operate. As a result, when hard times hit, they would face foreclosure. Additionally, unrestrained monopolies in transportation, steel, oil, rubber, banks, and many other essential areas kept rates artificially high. To be sure, the Industrial Revolution had created a vibrant middle class, and it had also created a gilded age for the industrialists and a scale of wealth heretofore unimaginable for a few. But it also created a large and growing class of depressed incomes, an income disparity similar to the one we face, a disproportionate standard of living much wider than before the Civil War. And thus began the populist or progressive revolt. It would last 50 years and would decline with the prosperity created by World War I. But it left a legacy that is once again stirring, calls for a more level playing field and wider opportunities for all. I'll let Professor O'Donnell lead us through this, but as he does, watch for Coxey's Army, the first major protest march in American history. Watch for the many problems farmers face that are beyond their control. Watch for the rise of the grain and its initial purpose. Watch for its transformation into a powerful political movement that came to dominate Midwest politics. Watch for the Granger laws, their initial successes, and why they then declined. Watch for the emergence of populism out of the ashes of Grangerism. Watch for the populists running a third-party presidential candidate in the 1888 election. Watch for the Democratic Party adopting populist progressive proposals, including the money supply, and the famous Cross of Gold speech by William Jennings Bryan at the 1896 Democratic Convention. Blair, how did it go? You will not crucify mankind on a cross of gold. And finally, watch for the political realignment of the country. And it would remain largely that way until the 1960s would shake it all up again.
On Easter Sunday, 1894, a man named Jacob Coxey set out on a journey from his hometown of Massillon, Ohio. Joining him were about 100 other men. Their destination was Washington, D.C. Coxey's Army, as they came to be called, eventually numbered about 500. And when they arrived in the nation's capital, they had earned the distinction of being the first major protest march in American history to converge on Washington, D.C. So what was all the fuss about? Well, the immediate answer was that the United States was in the midst of a severe economic depression, triggered by the Panic of 1893. Tens of thousands of businesses and farms had failed, and unemployment rate hovered at about 25%. The U.S. had already seen its share of economic depressions during the 19th century, including the Panic of 1837, the Panic of 1857, the Panic of 1873, just to name a few. In each case, of these previous cases, political leaders had agreed that the best policy was do nothing. Depressions, the reasoning went, were like bad weather or an illness. Wait long enough, and the good times and good health would return. But now, there was growing support among many Americans for the government to take a more active role in the economy, to protect the vulnerable from exploitation, and to promote the greatest possible amount of opportunity for all. Given the severity of the downturn, Coxey advocated that the federal government abandon its traditional commitment to laissez-faire economics and instead create public works projects such as road building to alleviate mass unemployment. Now, does this sound familiar? Yes, Coxey was advocating an approach to economic crisis that would be embraced 40 years later by Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the Great Depression. To draw attention to his idea, Coxey organized the march to Washington, D.C. As the press picked up on the story, Coxey and his growing number of followers were greeted by enthusiastic supporters in towns all along the route. Coxey had hoped to assemble an actual army of about 100,000 men, but he settled for only about 500. Some critics charged that Coxey and his followers were dangerous radicals determined to attack the government and the capitalist economy. But Coxey declared that his was a campaign to save the republic and honest capitalism from the clutches of corporate trusts and the politicians that they controlled. Coxey's army arrived in Washington on May 1st, 1894. Denied entry into the Capitol building, Coxey delivered an impassioned address on its steps. He said, "We stand here today in behalf of millions of toilers whose petitions have been buried in committee rooms, whose prayers have been unresponded to, and whose opportunities for honest, remunerative, productive labor have been taken from by unjust legislation which protects idlers, speculators, and gamblers." Unfortunately for Coxey, he was arrested for disturbing the peace. Eventually, those charges were reduced, and he was convicted simply for walking on the lawn of the Capitol grounds. While Jacob Coxey did not get what he came for in Washington, the larger movement that he belonged to, the populist movement, did achieve notable successes. Let's begin by looking at the struggles many American farmers faced in the late 19th century. Tens of thousands of people had headed west after the Civil War to take advantage of the Homestead Act and other opportunities to acquire land to become farmers. While some succeeded, many others faced a series of difficult challenges. First, farmers faced some of the same problems that had existed since the very beginning of agriculture, thousands of years before. Unpredictable weather patterns brought plentiful rains in some years and severe drought in other years. A folk song from the period captures the mood of the despair. "We've reached a land of desert sweet, where nothing grows for man to eat. I look across the plains and wonder why it never rains." Other natural threats came from insects like locusts and grasshoppers that often devoured a farmer's crops in just a matter of days. Even when farmers enjoyed good weather and bountiful harvests, there was no guarantee that they'd earn an adequate profit. Prices paid for crops fluctuated wildly year to year in responses to changes in supply and demand. As a result, a bumper crop of wheat or corn often meant a glutted market and low prices. Another problem was growing international competition. In the 1880s, wheat farmers on the plains saw prices fall due to competition with less expensive wheat grown in South America and Australia. At the same time that farmers saw prices plummet, they often faced high rates charged by railroads to transport their goods to market and from warehouse owners for the storage of these products. Low prices from farm products, combined with high costs, made it difficult for many farmers to get by. Nearly all farmers in this period and since carried a lot of debt. They had to borrow money to buy land or to finance the purchase of mechanical reapers or just to get by during poor years. In many cases, farmers put up their farms as collateral to secure these loans. So as a result, when the hard times hit, farmers faced the threat of foreclosure by banks they borrowed money from. And finally, it's worth mentioning that farm life in the West could also be extremely lonely. The first effort to ease the plight spotlight of the American farmer came in 1867, when a man named Oliver Kelly founded an organization called The Grange, or Patrons of Husbandry. Now, initially, Kelly promoted The Grange as a social and educational organization dedicated to promoting fellowship and fraternity among farmers isolated from one another. Grangers, as the organization's members were called, shared new ideas about farming through a newsletter, and many of them attended lectures offered by traveling agricultural experts. By the early 1870s, the organization had several hundred chapters across the country with several 100,000 loyal members. Then came the Panic of 1873. That economic crash triggered the worst depression in American history to that time, and its effects reached every corner of the economy, from manufacturing to agriculture. For farmers, it led to plummeting prices that left many of them unable to pay creditors who demanded payment for loans they had granted so farmers could buy land and equipment. And to make matters worse, railroads maintained extremely high prices to transport farm produce to market. Before long, hundreds of thousands of farmers faced ruin. In their desperation, farmers transformed the Grange into a powerful political movement that came to dominate Midwestern politics for the rest of the 1870s. By 1874, Granger parties, as they were called, controlled several state legislatures, including Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota, and they also enjoyed significant influence in many other Midwestern states. Their representatives used their power to enact a series of Granger laws, which were some of the earliest regulations of powerful corporations, banks, and railroads, especially the railroads. Farmers argued that the high rates charged by railroads to transport and store agricultural commodities were made possible because railroads operated like monopolies that were guilty of extortion. So what were these Granger laws? Well, some of them set maximum rates for transporting and storing grain. Others banned practices such as offering preferred customers special rates. Railroad officials, not surprisingly, denounced these efforts to curb their power and profit as unconstitutional and sued. The Supreme Court, however, in two key cases, one in 1876 called Peek versus Chicago and the Northwestern Railroad, and one in 1877, Munn versus Illinois, the court ruled that state legislatures did possess authority under the Constitution to regulate business. Well, despite these important legal victories, the Grange soon faded as an organization. And the cause was the end of the Depression of the late 1870s, and also a rise in farm prices, which ended the sense of crisis that had produced the Granger movement in the first place. In addition, as so often happens in America, the mainstream Republican and Democratic parties began to add lots of pro-farmer planks to their party platforms, and this made the Granger party seem, to many people anyway, less and less necessary. But the good times for farmers did not last. When low prices and hard times returned in the 1880s, farmer activism reappeared again in the form of farmers' alliances. These were associations dedicated to combining the power of individual farmers, often by cooperatives, against commodity buyers who paid them inadequate prices for their goods, and also against railroads that charged extortionate rates to move these goods to market. The Farmers' Alliances had more than 6 million members by the mid-1880s. In 1889, the Northern and Southern Farmers' Alliances united into one national alliance. And a third, the Colored Farmers' Alliance, had more than 1 million members of its own. The Alliance movement produced a number of colorful characters, none more so than Mary Elizabeth Lease. Widely known for her fiery and inspirational speeches, she was fond of saying to farmers that they needed to, quote, raise less corn and more help. Now let's look at how all this hardship and agrarian activism ultimately led to the creation of a full-blown third party, the People's Party. What happened was, despite their unprecedented activism, the agrarian alliances achieved very little. And so, like the Grangers in the 1870s, alliance leaders came to believe, by the late 1880s, that the only way that they could effectively battle the monopolies and trusts was to transform their movement into a political party. They would elect farmers or pro-farmer politicians who would then pass laws to curb the power of banks, railroads, and brokers and save the honest American farmer from ruin. By the summer of 1892, they had formed the People's Party, whose followers became known as populists. They also adopted a platform that included a series of reform proposals. But before we examine those proposals, it's important to hear the beginning section of this platform to get a sense of the populist vision of a nation on the brink of disaster. We meet in the midst of a nation brought to the verge of moral, political, and material ruin. Corruption dominates the ballot box, the legislatures, the Congress, and touches even the ermine of the bench. The people are demoralized. The newspapers are largely subsidized or muzzled. Public opinion silenced. Business prostrated. Homes covered with mortgages. Labor impoverished. And the land concentrating in the hands of capitalists. The urban working men are denied the right to organize for self-protection. Imported pauperized labor beats down their wages. A hireling standing army, unrecognized by our laws, is established to shoot them down, and they are rapidly degenerating into European conditions. Note that last line, European conditions. That touches upon a major fear in 19th century America, that the Republic was losing its way and becoming more like Europe, a land of monarchy, aristocracy, fixed classes, haves and have-nots, and perpetual strife. The platform then took aim at the alarming trend of the concentration of wealth. The fruits of the toil of the millions are boldly stolen to build up colossal fortunes for a few, unprecedented in the history of mankind. And the possessors of those, in turn, despise the Republic and endanger liberty. From the same prolific womb of governmental injustice, we breed the two great classes, tramps and millionaires. American democracy, declared the populists, was broken. The two main political parties were in the grip of big business. As a consequence, while the masses suffered impoverishment and injustice, Congress did nothing to remedy the certain situation. We seek to restore the government of the Republic to the hands of the plain people, with which class it originated. We assert our purposes to be identical with the purposes of the National Constitution, to form a more perfect union and establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. We believe that the power of government, in other words, of the people, should be expanded to the end that oppression, injustice, and poverty shall eventually cease in the land. The last part of the document lists the populist specific demands, all of which aimed to diminish monopoly power, strengthen democracy, and empower the government to take on new roles to achieve these goals, and to ensure fairness and widespread opportunity. These goals included the elimination of national banks, which the populists argued were just too big and too powerful. Another demand, the establishment of a national currency issued and controlled by the government and not by private banks. And here they were essentially prescribing what would eventually be, would take place 25 years later with the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank. They also called for an end to speculation in land and land accumulation by large corporations, with all surplus property not being used by these corporations to be returned to the government for distribution to everyday citizens. Another demand, elimination of government subsidies and grants to private businesses, for example, land grants to railroads. Here we see an expression of the traditional anti-monopolism that originated much earlier in the 19th century. The most vivid example of that was under the presidency of Andrew Jackson. Subsidies and grants from the government rewarded insiders with political connections at the expense of the common man and woman. Another demand, government ownership of railroads and telegraphs. The idea underpinning this demand was that in a modern industrial society, certain natural monopolies, as they called them, emerged. And these became so fundamental to everyday life that they needed to be taken over and administered by the government. Many European nations would nationalize their railroads and communication systems, for example. But in the US, it tended to occur on a smaller scale, say, for example, with water systems or urban subway systems. Think of it as a targeted application of essentially a socialist idea. The adoption of a graduated income tax. Now, there were two impulses behind this reform. First, almost all federal revenue that ran the government came from tariffs, that is, taxes that were imposed on imports. Well, the populists argued that this amounted to a massive freebie for American manufacturers that was paid for by American consumers in the form of high prices. Second, populists argued that a graduated income tax was needed to make those individuals and corporations that made such stupendous fortunes in the modern industrial era pay their fair share. Men like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller earned tens of millions of dollars a year and paid no taxes on it. Another demand, abolish the gold standards, which populists argued favored the wealthy and banks, and in its place, adopt a currency based on the free coinage of silver, which they argued favored the common man and debtors. Now, by free coinage, the populists didn't mean cost-free coinage, but rather the sort of an idea of unlimited coinage. This measure, they said, would benefit the masses and curb the monopolies and trusts by putting more money into circulation and thus lowering the value of a dollar that was backed exclusively by gold. Gold, the People's Party supporters contended, was the metal of elites and Wall Street. Silver, on the other hand, was presented as the metal of the common man. Another demand, the creation of government-owned sub-treasuries. These were public facilities for the storage of grain and other farm produce. During years of surplus crops and low prices, the government would store the produce, and then in future years of scarcity and high prices, it would sell it. In this way, a targeted use of government power would greatly diminish the year-to-year booms and busts that made farming so difficult. Yet another demand, the popular election of U.S. senators. Here the populists sought to reclaim democratic power for the masses. Up to this point in U.S. history, senators did not stand for election by the people. Rather, they were appointed by state legislatures. And populists argued that this practice was undemocratic, and it insulated senators from the people, the people that they ostensibly represented. So here the populists were anticipating the adoption 20 years later of the 17th Amendment that required the popular election of senators. Another demand, the introduction of the referendum and initiative. Here we also see an effort to increase the power of the people. A referendum allowed a legislature to submit a law for public approval or disapproval at the ballot box. An initiative allowed the people themselves to write laws and place them on the ballot for approval or disapproval by the people. Another reform they called for was the adoption of the secret ballot. Most Americans up to the 1890s voted in the open, allowing for all to see for whom they cast their ballots. Well, populists and other reformers argued that this practice left voters really vulnerable to the intimidation by the major parties, so they called for secret balloting. The populists, hoping to broaden their appeal by forging ties with the labor movement, also expressed support for industrial workers to achieve the 8-hour day and other reforms. Well, this multifaceted populist platform was approved at the National People's Party Convention that also nominated candidates for national office. Union Army veteran James B. Weaver was nominated for president of the People's Party, and Confederate Army veteran James G. Field of Virginia was nominated for vice president. The Democrats nominated Grover Cleveland, and the Republicans Benjamin Harrison. The leaders of the People's Party realized they faced formidable odds in going up against the major political parties. James Weaver, recognizing that with minimal name recognition and virtually no money, he decided to break with American political tradition. See, in those days, it was considered unseemly for a presidential candidate to actually go out on the campaign trail. Instead, typically, candidates stayed at home and spoke to journalists, while supporters traveled the country giving speeches. Ignoring this tradition, Weaver went on a national campaign, personally traveling the country and delivering speeches to thousands of enthusiastic crowds. But in the end, Weaver and the populists finished a distant third. The winner, Grover Cleveland soundly defeated Benjamin Harrison. But Weaver and the populists raised some eyebrows. Weaver actually won 4 states, Colorado, Kansas, Idaho, and Nevada. And he received more than 1 million popular votes, along with 22 electoral votes. Results on the local and state levels were even more impressive. Populists managed to elect 1,500 candidates to state legislatures, 3 governors, 5 U.S. senators, and 10 representatives to Congress. Many people believe this strong outcome was but the beginning of a growing wave of popular support for the People's Party. The next test would come in the midterm elections of 1894. And here, the populists were aided by two developments. The first, the economic crash triggered by the Panic of 1893. This economic crash, as I noted in my introduction about Coxey's army, caused widespread suffering. Thousands of businesses closed, unemployment hit 25% in many places. Then, just as the brutal impact of the Depression began to set in, a second event occurred that populists hoped would draw attention to their message of economic fairness and boost their popularity. That was the Pullman strike of 1894. Workers at the Pullman Sleeping Car Company walked off the job in the spring of 1894, after company officials slashed their pay but refused to cut the cost of their rent and food prices. This small strike soon went national when members of the American Railway Union announced that they would support the Pullman strikers by refusing to handle any Pullman cars. Given the fact that Pullman cars were everywhere, this policy brought the nation's rail system to a near complete standstill. President Cleveland, at the urging of railroad executives, sent in the army to break the strike. The ensuing violence left more than 100 workers dead. In the end, Pullman workers lost the strike, and most of them lost their jobs. Populists hoped that the economic suffering brought on by the Depression and the harsh actions of the federal government in repressing the Pullman strike would boost the appeal of the People's Party at the polls in the 1894 off-year elections. The party, often acting in alliance with sympathetic candidates affiliated with the major parties, did win some significant victories in the election. For example, in North Carolina, a coalition of People's Party and Republican Party candidates won control of the state government. People's Party leaders hoped to build on this electoral success and pose a serious challenge to the major parties in the presidential election year of 1896. But events did not play out as the populists had hoped. Nonetheless, this election proved to be one of the most significant in American history. Republicans chose as their presidential nominee former Congressman and Governor of Ohio, William McKinley. The Republicans also upheld the conservative commitment to the gold standard and a high tariff. Sensing the rising popularity of populist ideas, particularly the idea of free silver, the Democrats nominated a young and dynamic congressman from Nebraska named William Jennings Bryan, and they made free silver a key plank in their party platform. Bryan was only 36 years old, but he already had earned a reputation for his stirring speeches against the tariff and in favor of free silver. He then delivered one of the most famous speeches in American history. "I come to speak to you," he told the assemblage, "in defense of a cause as holy as the cause of liberty, the cause of humanity." Their cause, said Bryan, represented the wage earner, the merchant, the farmer, and the miner. "It is for these that we speak. We are fighting in the defense of our homes, our families, our posterity. We have petitioned, and our petitions have been scorned. Their critics called them radicals who advocated dangerous unconstitutional measures. But Bryan dismissed this claim, saying that the world had changed dramatically since the days of Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin. The new conditions of the Industrial Revolution required new policies to ensure the vitality of American liberty. The principles upon which rests democracy are as everlasting as the hills, but they must be applied to new conditions as they arise. Conditions have arisen, and we are attempting to meet those conditions." Bryan also rejected what we know today as trickle-down economics. He said, "There are two ideas of government. There are those conservatives who believe that if you just legislate to make the well-to-do prosperous, that their prosperity will leak through to those below. The Democratic idea has been that if you legislate to make the masses prosperous, their prosperity will find its way up and through every class that rests upon it. The primary focus of the speech was his call for free coinage of silver. The common American citizen, he said, was being impoverished by an elite few who insisted on the gold standard. As he ended his speech, Bryan thundered his most famous lines: "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." The emergence of Bryan and the Democrats' embrace of the silver issue left the People's Party facing a bit of a dilemma. Most populist activists had expected the Democrats to follow the Republicans and stick with the gold standard. This would have left the potent silver issue just to them. But now, the People's Party had a pretty big decision to make. Nominate a different candidate and divide support between the silver issues with the Democrats, or, as was common practice among small parties in the 19th century, fall in line and nominate Bryan, the Democrat, as their candidate. In July of 1896, the People's Party chose the latter option and nominated Bryan. But to run for vice president, they selected one of their own, populist leader Tom Watson of Georgia. Bryan, taking a cue from the People's Party candidate 4 years earlier, James Weaver, bucked the tradition of staying at home and embarked on one of the most extraordinary campaigns in American history. In all, he traveled more than 18,000 miles through 27 states and delivered more than 600 stump speeches to 3 million people. Bryan's campaign generated much enthusiasm, but ultimately not enough votes on election day. The Republican McKinley, who was backed with an unprecedented amount of corporate money, won with 51% of the vote to Bryan's 47%. Now, one significant outcome of the contest was a major political realignment. The Republicans, portraying themselves as the party of economic prosperity and international power, now became the dominant party in the Midwest and in the Northeast. Democrats became the party of the South and of the West. The Democrats retained the populist belief that the government could and should do more to secure the well-being of the average citizen and limit the power of big business. But, given their base in the South, the Democrats also supported a states' rights philosophy that protected white supremacy. After 1896, the People's Party faded from the American political scene. Its demise reminds us that in all of American history, only a handful of third parties have ever survived. The last one was the Republican Party, way back in the 1850s. This tradition of short-lived third-party efforts brings to mind the words of the famous historian Richard Hofstadter, who wrote once that, quote, "Third parties are like bees. Once they have stung, they die." But while the People's Party stung and died, its ideas lived on. For there soon emerged in the early 20th century a reform movement led by people who called themselves progressives. These reformers succeeded in gaining enactment of many of the People's Party core agenda items, including the graduated income tax, the direct election of U.S. senators, the creation of a central bank, Federal Reserve, secret balloting, and the initiative and referendum.
Well, it's always interesting to me. We think we live in interesting times, and here we do. But there have been very interesting times before. A couple of takeaways for me, and then we'll open it up. The bitter irony of political realignments that we have seen. The Democrats became the primary party of the South and the West during this period, and while it retained populist beliefs, it also was enamored with states' rights, and sometimes that did lead to the rise and perpetuation of Jim Crow. LBJ would change that, and the South would become Republican. People's Party has faded from the political scene, but we are the inheritors of many of its core ideas. Now we've talked about the graduated income tax, direct election of U.S. senators. You know, we're so used to thinking, well, of course, that's how they're elected. Creation of the Federal Reserve Bank. It had different goals than the United States Bank did. Secret ballots, we assumed, not having our shoulder overlooked to see, I think you voted the wrong way. And finally, the initiative and referendum. Once again, great ways that the people can participate. The legislature can put an initiative on the ballot and let the people vote it up or down. And people, if they get enough signatures, can put a referendum issue on the ballot and let the people vote it up and down regardless of what the legislature wants. And the general sense, I think, that we do better when we get organized and get into action than we do when we simply snipe at each other. Well, observations, comments. Let me turn the microphone here. Anything come to mind, Mr. Blair?
Well, one of the things that he did not get to, because it didn't quite happen here, but there's that old economics exam question of if you're the dictator and you've got an economy that's not doing well, what is the most effective way of getting it moving? The answer, of course, is start a war. And this happened a couple of years later, about 98, with the Spanish-American War, and the origins of that, I think it got started, I think are still a bit questionable.
Yes.
He mentioned in passing the segregation bit, why the South went Democrat as opposed to Republican, and that I think was much more important than any of the other ideas that may have affected the South.
I agree with you. Yeah.
But on the other hand, on this business of silver, remember until, 30 years ago, your dollar bill said it was a silver certificate.
That's right.
And you were able, presumably, and some people did, go to your bank and trade in the bill for a couple of pieces of silver.
Yeah. Was it Roosevelt that took us off the gold standard, and then Nixon took us off the silver standard? I think.
Yeah.
So we're no longer linked to money. I mean, two bills.
Well, you figure, where is most of the gold being mined these days? It was coming, at least at that time, it was coming out of Russia and South Africa. Yeah. And we were not happy with either place. So why tie our currency to something that somebody we don't like can control?
That's right. Good point. It was different when we had the gold.
Yes.
We could mine it.
Yeah, well, you know the golden rule.
Tell us. I know what it is, but I love it.
Yeah, okay. The one with the gold rules.
He who has the gold makes the rules. Any other comments, observations? All right, well, just to pitch, if you're free at 1:30 on Wednesday, we have Theodora from Dance Hall Girl and Prostitute to Empress of the Eastern Roman Empire. And next week it'll be on QB because of the work done here. And I always have to look, oh yeah, Blair, the Rough Riders and the Imperialistic Dream. Teddy Roosevelt goes to Cuba. All right, well, thank you for coming.